big subject. So we'd like to. We need three readers today. Who will volunteer to read? 3 readers. Who's going to volunteer?
I think Anya should start because we haven't heard her voice for so long.
Anya, start.
Great, okay.
So
There's-
it's the set of emptiness and nothingness.
The aesthetics of emptiness and nothingness. The Tao does nothing, and yet nothing is left undone. Lao Tzu.
It's a Neolithic jade, what's called a bidis. There's nothing ever been published, obviously, before writing. So it's sort of something like 6, 7 centuries.
One of the earliest surviving artifacts of Chinese culture are in the form of jade bidiscs, in which there is an empty center. There is no written account of the function of these forms, and so it is uncertain what they signified. But they were employed within the burial rituals as a symbol of the sky or heaven. Oh, sorry. Let's make this bigger. The travelers are depicted as a minor event within the organization of the visual expanse. The mountain rock face signifies geological time outside of human time, its extent being vast. The act of simply passing through it is merely a brief interval of time when measured against the cosmic process opened by the loop of water and rock in play. Behind this play of appearance is the notion that all things emerge out of emptiness and return to this condition. Fan Kuan, early 11th century, travelers among mountains and streams.
So if you look right to the bottom of the scroll, you can see these very small figures passing through. So they're absolutely minute compared with the rock or the mountain in the background.
Before painting, Guo would meditate for several days in order to empty his mind of habitual representations. This process of releasing the mind from fixed preoccupations opens out a vision of what should be retained and what passes through in order to realize the mind and nature as a continuous loop of becoming. Guo Zi, 1020 to 1090, early spring 1072.
So it's signed and dated. So there's some of the earliest signed and dated paintings in the history of art.
Muki, 8 views around the area of Xiao Xiang, circa 1250.
That's Southern Song. So first 2 paintings are Northern Song. This is Southern Song. The Southern Song capital was Hangzhou, which at the time was the richest capital in the world.
Fu Ding, early 11th century.
Northern Song.
Ma Yuan, 1150 to 1230, Stories of Water.
He did these album leaves of just water on the different mists rising from water, storm rising from water. So different types of water, but it's almost like there's no figure and ground relationship, just pure event of water taking its different forms, notations. They're in Beijing in the museum.
Emptiness does not fail to illuminate, and illumination does not fail to empty. Liang Kai predicted what became known as the thrown or splashed ink technique. He often drank heavily before painting. Li Po chanting a poem. Liang Kai, 1140 to 1210.
So Li Po is a very famous Tang poet, one of the most famous Tang poets of the approximately 7th, 8th century.
Muki, 6 Persimmons, Southern Song.
It's very famous in Japan, almost. I think this is in Japan, and it's one of the inspirations of Zen painting in Japan.
Nizan Yuan Dynasty.
As you can see, there's the heart's empty, and it signifies China was invaded by the Mongols. A lot of the intellectuals took to the mountains and didn't stay in the court, became Aimin, which is outsider. So they protested through a kind of indication of not being there, of absence.
In 1354, Nizan painted Empty Pavilion in a pine grove. The empty pavilion depicts the abandoned home due to the war-torn condition of China in the period of the Yuan dynasty. In another context, such as depiction, might have Taoist or Buddhist connotations, a remote emptiness indicating enlightenment. But here the setting calls forth a mood of lament and perhaps stoical resistance. The empty hut, a non-place, stands adrift from dwelling, becoming in turn an image of something that cannot be directly represented, non-being. The painting deals with heavy matters, but disguise is also there within the lightness of touch that actualizes the painting itself. The artist assumes two positions, one of an outsider looking in, and one of being adrift in time, following traces of memory within the empty terrain. Oh, it's so beautifully written.
There's Zen garden in Edo. Just read this last one and then we'll change.
The Indian idea of zero or null number is associated with the idea of nothing. The literal meaning was void and represented an empty slot in counting system. In Sanskrit, the Hindu name for zero is Sunya, whilst the Arabic is Sifr, which both mean empty one. Medieval Latin transcribed in the Arab word to Zifrium or Zifrium. In Italian, it gradually evolved to Zifro, to Zefro, and Zevere. The Indian system of counting has been one of the most successful intellectual innovations ever made on our planet. The Chinese came into contact with the Indian system in the 8th century and adopted the Indian circular zero. The Hebrew tradition connected with the Indian system in the 12th century, and zero was given the Hebrew word for the wheel. The Indo-Arabic system of numbers came into Europe through Spain, and by the 13th century was in use in commerce and trade. What is the sound of one hand clapping?
Painting called Enso.
1686 to 1768.
He's also a priest, painter priest. Who's next? Who's reading next?
I can.
Go ahead.
The calligraphy refers to a dialogue between Daruma and Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, and capture the essence of Zen Buddhism, as reported in Hekiganroku, published in 1300. The emperor met the monk in the year 520. Do I read like that? And asked him about how he had obtained for supporting Buddhism. When he says absolutely nothing, the emperor, irritated, asked what was then the foundation of Buddhism, and the answer was a great void and no holiness. More and more annoyed, he then asked, "Who are you?" And Bodhidharma replied, "I do not know." After his dialogue, Bodhidharma was no more welcome at the court, and he took refuge in a cave in the Shaolin Temple on Mount Song, where he sat in meditation for 9 years. The painting represents this first development status of Chinese Zen tradition. Bodhidharma, who sits still and quiet in front of a white wall. Jiong Onko Daruma, 1804. Maybe change a person. I just found that my washing machine is working, sorry.
The Gandharan sculpture of an empty footprint, which was one of the earliest representations of the Buddha, rather than the human form. Did someone read?
I could read.
Oh, good.
According to Mahayana Buddhism, the truth is that all things arise moment to moment without causation. Hence, from absolute nothingness or emptiness, shunyata, we suffer because we attempt to make the nothingness. We are into a solid and enduring thing based on assumptions of dualistic thought.
This is a Gandharan Buddha head in stucco. It's in the V&A, one of the great, it's 4th, 5th century from Afghanistan. You can see the trace of pigment, particularly on the lips. So it follows Greek sculpture and painting the sculpture. So the head would be gilded originally, and the eyes would be painted in, lips were painted.
Yoga is the cessation of the movements of the mind. Then there is abiding in the seer's own form, Patanjali.
Patanjali was a great philosopher of yoga.
Shiva Nataraja, Shola, South Indian.
So it's around the 10th, 11th century. It's one of the great sculptural figures in world sculpture. On the left hand is a flame, and the other hand, on the other side is the hour bell, the drum beating out time. So it's giving rise to the Big Bang singularity of the universe, exploding in occasioning time and space. His foot is on the dwarf of ignorance, floats on the water. So it's a cosmic dance. They were paraded through the streets on festivals. So the two holes in the base where the wooden slats would pass through.
Jain sculpture, 19th century. Musuna, Memories from History, Tenkai Jaco, 2012. Ciphers of the Void. Jean Sanchez, Bhutan, Quinch, Cabbage, Melon, Cucumber, 1602.
It's one of the great Spanish still life paintings. Almost perfect geometry of a passage, a line through the vegetables and fruit, and supported by a void. He was painting this in a monastery, so it didn't leave an explanation of it. But he was formerly a painter of religious subjects, but when he went into the monastery, he painted vegetables and fruit, still lives.
But what is the image? When there is nothing, that is where the image finds its condition but disappears into it. Blanche,
Unsure.
two versions of the imagery. Caspar David Friedrich, Monk by the Sea.
It's the first part of the 19th century. Almost a double feeling of infinity, a kind of the monk looking out over a vast extent of what would be called the mathematical sublime, the sublime of the extent. And if you stand outside of the image, there's also another relationship to an infinity. So it's a double infinity. This is This is the Jaina romantic poet Hölderlin, who was a philosopher and a poet.
Sign are we, without meaning. Without pain, we are we, and have nearly lost our language in foreign lands. Frederick Hölderlin, 1770-1843. Caspar David Friedrich, Rocky Reef on the Seashore. According to novelists, life is precisely what is beyond, and thus at the foundation of the distinction between the ego and the non-ego. It is being beyond beings, or as he puts it, the oscillation between being and non being.
Novalis again was a philosopher poet. Also a novelist.
Goya, the Dog, 1820.
It's in the Prado, what part of his black paintings. It's unsure whether the dog is drowning in sand or swimming. Sort of doesn't really, it's a very ambiguous image. Kind of almost terrifying, but
Is there a figure in the background though? I've never noticed before, but I can see tonight like a figure. It's
like
his
shadows.
Mm.
That's accidental.
Mm.
It's only a small painting, but it's got a sort of terror attached to it.
There is nothing in heaven or on earth which does not contain in itself being and nothingness. Hegel. Garrick Hall's portraits of the insane were painted without having a world to see. In effect, paintings that look back without the possibility that they in turn might be properly viewed because they strip out the perspective through which this might occur. The image is not cast as a look, but rather indicates the nature of the encounter of the self that is no longer joined to the world through its act of projection. Madness for Foucault is a form of déjà of death, because the head that will become a skull is already empty. He states in Madness and Civilization that the madman sees the daylight, the same daylight as the man of reason. Both live in the same brightness. But seeing this same daylight and nothing but daylight, he sees it as a void, as night, as nothing. Manet, Olympia, 1863.
I've always speculated that she's in fact looking back at herself in a mirror, not looking at the male other. She's looking at herself and indirectly looking at the black maid who brings flowers to her. It would change the commentary if she is looking at the mirror, but he painted his last great painting, Bar at Falabajeur, also has a mirror. So it's very close to looking at Velasquez and his use of mirrors in paintings. So I think there's a lot of art historical reason to believe that she looks at a mirror rather than looks at the male other. But that's just a guess. Or inform me, I don't know which.
Marcel Duchamp, 50cc d'Air de Paris, 1919. Silence is a word which is not a word, and breath is an object which is not an object. Georges Bataille. Language can only begin with the void. No plenitude, no certainty can ever speak. Something essential is lacking in anyone who expresses himself. Negation is tied to language. When I first begin, I do not speak in order to say something. Rather, a nothing demands to speak. Nothing speaks, nothing finds in speech, and the being of speech is nothing. This formulation explains why literature's ideal has been this: to speak and say nothing. Maurice Blanche. Every something is an echo of nothing. When you start working, everybody is in your studio: the past, your friends, enemies, the art world, and above all, your own ideas. All are there. But as you continue painting, they start leaving one by one, and you are left completely alone. Then, if you're lucky, even you leave. John Cage. Joseph Beuys Institution. Intuitions. Intuition 1968. Does anyone want to take over?
Who's next?
Because there's someone, like, there'll be some noise. Is someone,
I'll have a go if you want.
yeah, thank
Okay, Robert Smithson, Museum of the Void, 1969. Gerhard Richter, Candle, 1983. Andre Todt, Zero Demonstration, 1979. Reification. Imagine that she is not looking back at the male other, but instead looking at herself in the mirror. What is she then looking at? Perhaps a subject estranged from herself, seeing herself through the other, but lost in turn in a sea of indifference, cast as emptiness. Inside and outside become congealed as if opaque.
That should be next to the Olympia by Money.
In Claude Cahun's What Do You Make of Me in 1928, two contraposed profiles construct a non-symmetrical hybrid image. The image suggests a form of impossible dialogue in which eyes never meet. The montage denaturalizes vision in order to open the unconsciousness to the play of otherness. In this image, the suggestion of spectrality looms beyond the splitting of realist identification. The question of original on the level of identity is probed in her work to the point of the very question itself becoming dissembled. For Cahun, identity is a series of masks behind masks in an unending recessional space that can never be measured. Edward Hopper, New York movie, 1939. When subject looks at itself, it no longer sees anything, or there cannot be anything to see. Not being an object as subject cannot be seen. That is the mirror-like void, the absence of anything seen, of anything seeable, which subject is. Wei Wu Wei. Edward Hopper, 1927. Edward Hopper was a painter who occasioned the meeting point between the invariably isolated subject and empty space. In the age of mass society, a fragmented sense of isolation was a persuasive feature of his art. Edward Hopper, Room by the Sea, 1951. Edward Hopper, Room in New York, 1932. Nothingness Haunts Being, Sartre. Francis Bacon, Study for Portrait 2, After the Life Mask of William Blue, 1955. Vika Selman's Untitled, 1970. Vika Selman's Desert, 1975. Just Dust. The word timeless is taken to mean eternal, but Selman's isn't chasing timelessness exactly. She's documenting the effect of the violent interaction of her subject, an ocean, a desert, a sky, with geological, astronomical time, against which human life is almost minute. Sarah Manguso. Vika Selman's Clouds, 1968. Gerhard Richter, Seascape, Green Gray, Cloudy, 1969.
The Sugimoto's Ocean series. They started off as being when they first exhibited, they're very small prints. And a recent show at the Hayward retrospective was that they become vast. And I prefer them as very small prints.
Sugimoto's Ocean series depicts scenes bereft of human trace. There is a sense not only of erasure of history, but also the manifestation of the feeling that the origin and the finality of things is within emptiness. What is truly beautiful is something that has withstood time. Time, advancing with its unforgiving power to rot, intends to return everything to the soil. True beauty is that which has survived time and preserved in color and form. At some point, there will come a time when its color and shape will fade away. This world is the interval where something shifts from being to nothingness. Something in that interval, beauty sparkles like a solved riddle from a secret language. Bleach Journal, Hiroshi Sugimoto, In Setting Sun, Aperture Foundation. In a portrait painting by Luc Tuymans called Secrets, 1990, which depicts Albert Speer, Speer's eyes both appear closed and even painted out, as if they will never open again. Perhaps he surveys the wreckage of history, condemned to no longer cast his eyes upon the light of the day.
Just read one more and then we'll swap.
Okay. Mark Tanzi, Rob Grillet, Cleansing Every Object in Sight, 1981.
If we look closely, they're all monuments, all the stones and dust and debris, vast monuments from past civilizations. Everything become minute. We'd like to read. Not an easy one to start with.
I'm happy to.
Go.
But the life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when, in utter dismemberment, it finds itself. It is this power, not as something positive which closes its eyes to the negative, as when we say something that is nothing or is false. and then, having done with it, turn away and pass on to something else. On the contrary, spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. Hegel, The Phenomenology of the Spirit.
And in the preface, one of the most famous sections from the preface, so he wrote the preface at the end of writing the full book.
Gold mine Serra Pelado, Brazil, Salgado.
Delgado started life as in banking and switched to doing photography.
Nan Golden, Nan and Brian in Bed from 1983. Nan Golden, Bruce in Fog, Pozzoli, Italy, 1995. Akiko Takezawa, Shadows on the Hill. Falling, leaping, and sinking.
Eve Klein, Leap into the Void.
Finding yourself in a hole, at the bottom of a hole, in almost total solitude, and discovering that only writing can save you. To be without the slightest subject for a book, the slightest idea for a book, is to find yourself, once again, before a book. A vast emptiness, a possible book, before nothing, before something like living, naked writing, like something terrible, terrible to overcome. Jan Bas Ada, Fall, 1970.
These series of falls into the canal, rode his bicycle into the canal, filmed it.
Jan Bas Ada set sail to cross the Atlantic in a performance work. He disappeared without a trace.
I literally did this performance where he never returned.
It's the ultimate performance, isn't it? Imagine you are falling, but there is no ground. Many contemporary philosophers have pointed out that the present moment is distinguished by a prevailing condition of groundlessness. We cannot assume any stable ground on which to base metaphysical claims or foundational political myths. At best, we are faced with temporary, contingent, and partial attempts at grounding. But if there is no stable ground available for our social lives and philosophical aspirations, the consequence must be a permanent, or at least intermittent state of free fall for subjects and objects alike. Ito Stereo, in Free Fall, a thought experiment on vertical perspective. Sebastião Salgado, Mexico, 1980. Consciousness is not what it is, and is what it is not. Jean-Paul Sartre. The idea that humans are not entities but the clearing in which entities appear leads to a notion that human existence is the openness, clearing, or nothingness in which things can manifest themselves. Heidegger opposed the Cartesian tradition which conceived humans as self-conscious substances standing over objects. Heidegger believed that the human being is not a thing, but rather a peculiar kind of nothingness, or the absencing in which things can present themselves and thus be. If humans are not things, then knowing cannot be a relation between two things such as mind and object. Traditionally, philosophers have defined the being of an entity as its ground or substance, and as such it constitutes a superior agency or foundation. For Heidegger, to be means it to disclose within the open or clearing in order that the presencing of entities can take place. Dasein means the place in which being occurs. Neither temporality nor being is an entity. Rather, they are the conditions necessary for entities to appear. If humans are the temporal openness or nothingness in which entities can appear as entities, then it is the mood of anxiety that reveals the nothingness lying at the heart of existence. Waiting for Godot caused a sensation when it first opened due to the fact that it appeared to have no literal meaning in any conventional sense. There was no sense of anything occurring which provided for an outcome or conclusion, and this heightened the feeling of futility. The setting of a play was stark and fragmentary. Endgame Lutko Ozskog, Samuel Beckett, 1966. Not I, Samuel Beckett, 1973.
The famous Billy Whitelaw performance.
A nothing we were, are, shall, remain, flowering, the nothing, the no one's rose. Paul Celan. Time is the substance from which I am made. Time is a river which carries me along, but I am the river. It is a tiger that devours me, but I am the tiger. It is a fire that consumes me, but I am the fire. Borges. In the late 1940s, Antonin Artaud wrote about the human face, stating that it is an empty force, a field of death. For Artaud, the human face has not begun to say what it is and what it knows. The face is a site of intersection between looking outward and looking within, at times without the recognition of such difference. Exile. In The Space of Literature, Blanchot evokes the idea of aesthetic exile when he states that the writer belongs to a language which no one speaks, which is addressed to no one, which has no center, and which reveals nothing. He may believe that he affirms himself in this language, but what he affirms is altogether deprived of self. Exiles have nowhere to wander and hence have no proper resting place. So often aesthetic exile is connected with a sense of placelessness. Alberto Giacometti, Portrait of Jean Genet, 1954-5. Jean Genet writes in his essay, The Studio of Alberto Giacometti, in 1958, that it is Giacometti's work that makes our universe even more unendurable to me. So much has this artist seemingly managed to discard what stood in his way in order to discover what is left of man when false pretenses are removed. Beauty has no other origin than the singular wound, different in every case, hidden or visible, which each man bears within himself, which he preserves and into which he withdraws when he wouldn't quit the world for a temporary but authentic solitude. Such art, then, is a far cry from what is called miserablism. Giacometti's art seems to me determined to discover the secret wound in each being and even in each thing in order to illuminate them. Philip Gaston's painting Smoking Eating from 1973. The empty railway track signifies the journey of being into non-being, the camps themselves conceived as efficient factories of annihilation. Kiefer, Eisensteig, Iron Path, 1986. In a late self-portrait, Robert Mapplethorpe floats in a sea of blackness. In her book Unmarked, Peggy Phelan describes this portrait. At the top of the stick above his white hand, an eyeless skull greets the viewer's gaze, threatening to reflect that gaze on the brink of vanishing. The image of the self, Mapplethorpe suggests, can only be glimpsed in its disappearance. To greet it, one risks blindness, vanishing.
And when he took this, he was dying of AIDS. It was one of his last self-portrait.
Tom Friedman, Untitled, 1999 to 2002. In his book, The Fragile Absolutes, Slavoj Zizek uses Coke as an example of an objet petit, a drink that functions as a direct embodiment of the it factor. The point Zizek makes is that the it is in fact anything at all other than the desire for more. So in the case of caffeine-free Diet Coke, we drink the nothingness itself, the pure semblance of a property that is in effect merely an envelope of a void. This situation is not, of course, unfamiliar in the art world, in which artists might appear to become signifiers of the principle of either emptiness or nihility. For Zizek, in today's art, the gap that separates the sacred place of sublime beauty from the excremental space of trash, leftover, is gradually narrowing up to the paradoxical identity of opposites. Are not modern art objects more and more excremental objects? Trash, often in quite literal sense, feces, rotting corpses, displayed in, made to occupy, to fill in the sacred place of the thing. From one moment to the next, we find ourselves sensibly and physically outside ourselves, outside the blind slipping away of our little stretch of time. We see the night that borders our time, and we touch on some aspect of it, not the future, but the coming of something or someone, the coming of something that is already of us and the world, but that has to come from somewhere else, displaced elsewhere into the unimaginable elsewhere. Jean-Luc Nancy. This is Neil Jenny, Husband and Wife, 1969. Everybody is nowhere, the nowhere of all souls. Two fragmentary phrases in Mao 11, or Mao 2, by Don DeLino. Happy to keep reading or happy to...
Yeah, someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else can read this last section.
You're really good.
I'll read.
Fine.
The monochrome presented an aspiration for a pure condition of painting, touched in turn with the absorption of the question of the end or death of painting. It is void of content because it occasions the loss of the figure in order that it might be a figure of itself. Pure painting aspiring to the absolute. Red, Yellow, Blue, 1921. We must revolutionize our optical perception. We must remove the veil from our eyes. Alexandra
Rodchenko.
Sorry. Barnett Newman, Galaxy, 1949. With early Christian art, painting was tolerated on the condition that it fulfilled the condition of clear speaking. There was the fear that painting might be capable of deception. The monochrome is the end of the cycle in which the dialect of the sensible and the illegible is played out. Bereft of depth, it severs the anticipation of narrative. Bereft of the image, it is without ambivalence. It is instead an encounter with a form that is close to being a non-subject. As a non-subject, it adheres to little outside itself. This is why it appears to stand apart. It cannot speak of things that it cannot by definition know. Let us simply say that the scene is vacant and therefore nothing is assumed. Ad Reinhardt, Blue, 1953.
As your eyes adjust, you can see the form beneath the blueness.
Lucio Fontana, red monochrome painting. Bryce Marden, Williamsburg, 2016 to 2017. Blinky Palermo, Omt Titel, Mit Rotten Street, 1970. Sorry, poor pronunciation of this. Park Seo-bo, Écriture, number 19 to 78, 1978. The monochrome is the historical attempt to solve the riddle of the identification of the artist with two essential gestures, the melancholic and the aesthetic. The melancholic gesture invariably consists of fallback into, whereas the aesthetic gesture consists of being thrown out of. If the monochrome creates an illusion of what is given or on hand, then it can repeat within a reoccurring principle. The cycle of in itself and for itself would be resolved. Matter would disappear in a network of both formal and ideal relations. But this is not what occurs, and this is why the monochrome does not elide within a common identity. The monochrome is a mode of asphasia, or lack of essential expression. Does this mean that anything can pass through, or the opposite? It is painting in waiting, painting playing a waiting game, only in waiting as a suspension of thought, waiting for the next turn, but with the suspicion that this might not materialize. Is this then a mode of waiting for nothing? The rhetoric of exemplary silence, forgetfulness, withdrawal, loss, impotence, all might be evoked, but perhaps bland is the most accurate or suitable. Bland relates to the idea of a center already vacated, so nothing much happens. Not intelligible enough to be read, not sensible enough to be purely visible, not material enough to become a production, not conceptual enough to become discourse. Never quite enough of anything, and yet it subsists. Painting that hallucinates the end of painting, whilst dwelling on the origins of painting. On both sides, there would disavowal or overcoming of immediacy, but the monochrome appears to be both related to the immediacy and latency, or at least a strange combination of presence and lack. We might suspect that the monochrome is close to the death drive, the death of painting, the circulation around repetition. Anyway, more on the side of drive as opposed to desire. Drive takes lack to be its object, whereas desire moves in the gap that separates it from its object.
Thank you for reading that. It's quite a task. That's it. So, fire away.
I've
Well,
always been,
So go ahead.
I've always been intrigued by the idea of everything and nothingness. So it was really interesting to listen to this, and that everything comes from nothing, and that nothing is everything, and everything is nothing. And to understand that, it took me a long time, but I found it fascinating. And it was, I think, from that I went on reading how two opposite things can exist at the same time. How something can be completely stationary and moving at the speed of light at the same time. And the opposites next to each other seem to be something that we humans, I think on the surface, we might not accept, but I think it's really important part of the definition of everything, that one thing cannot exist without its opposite.
What do you think the implication of that is in relation to the work of art?
I think art, perhaps what we call art wouldn't exist without what we say is not art. And we're always defining it. We always go to exhibitions and say, so this was shit, this was not art, this was, and trying to find a place in the universe for thoughts and notions and objects and things. And it's sometimes difficult to navigate. It very much depends on what is on a space where you're trying to define something. So one thing would be that thing when we compare it to everything surrounding it, especially in that space. So it may be that if we went to a remote island somewhere, our definition of art would be different to if we lived somewhere like in London, where we're so saturated and with incredible works, or a lot of bad art as well. Well, I think the definition of things is a very fluid thing, and it sort of changes with the environment around it. And with things surrounding it. And also the perception of us, of those things. Sorry, am I going on a tangent?
We need tangents.
Thank you.
We desperately need tangents. Any other thoughts?
My mind is empty.
I once exhibited a painting. It was 3 meters by 4 meters, and it was a self-portrait of me in like in a vest where you, or yes, in a second, and it was me in a vest going like this the whole evening. Wait a second.
Cassie has a young son.
That's no excuse to be put in a restraining suit.
Yes, yes, that was me. A portrait of me and it was gigantic, and it was on a white background. And a guy came over and said, "Oh, how much is this painting?" And I was at the very beginning of my education, and I thought, "Oh, 3,000 euros." And he, "Oh, this is a lot of white for 3,000." And you know, because there's no background, and I didn't paint it, you know, like me in a mountain scenario. I don't know. It was so much white it was too much white for 3,000 euros, and then I told you at the beginning, almost, I don't know, 10 years later, so I didn't sell it to him. I didn't sell the painting. And 10 years later, my last exhibition, I had a white piece of paper with 3 dots. And that was, one dot was the ashes of my mother, one dot was the ashes of her shoes, and one was the ashes of her passport. And it was called Tourist. And in this little piece of paper, nobody said, "Oh, this is a lot of white for whatever it will cost." I mean, I won't sell my mom actually, but it's nothing can be, it's just like a left out background in a painting or everything, you know, like, okay, there are just a few dots on a painting and on the work, and it means everything to you, and that's emptiness and nothingness, and it reminds me about these 2 stories when I think about art and leaving stuff out and not finishing everything like you know, it's interesting. And you can, and also if you have the ashes of a person's body, it's nothing. It's not the body anymore, but it's still something, and it's interesting. It made me think about that. So, yeah, that's it.
Because even if we go to the atomic level, we all made of like hands and, you know, heads and eyes, and we go deeper, there's like cells, and we open the cells, and there are molecules, and molecules are made of atoms, and you look further and they're like these tiny particles that we can't even like dissect, and it's just like emptiness in there, and the particles are like even hardly there, and some of them have mass. I mean, they have minute mass, but I think they try to break them and you get something called quarks. And they think quarks are made of energy. So, oh my God, what are we made of? We're made of nothing.
But I think there were some quotes about a quarter of the way back, which was talking, well, for me, it was starting to allude to this notion that a human being or a person is almost like a placeholder, like a space for this energetics to arrive, to come into, which I thought then linked to that James outline as well, where you've got the outline of the body, or the Buddha with the empty footprints. There's sort of it's just a space for, or a site for something to occur, for some sort of intersection of energetics to arrive, which is, I think, the same as an artwork as well. That's how an artwork appears from something. There's a space for it to arrive, to land. It's creating the right atmosphere or the right time and space, literally space, holding back that time and that moments to allow something to sort of pour in, and to you're just facilitating that space.
Like a lot of the, looking at the Van Gogh exhibition, a lot of the landscapes, when you close up, where there's just a field, and you go up close to the field, it's just brush marks, intense brush marks, and then it sort of just disintegrates into a kind of chaos swirl of color, but nothing essentially is there, but a kind of energetic ripple, kind of pulsation.
Which is Ania's idea about the human body, isn't it? It sort of all falls apart. Sort of the closer you get, the more it sort of falls apart. Small component pieces.
So again, the idea of one thing can have color and volume and mass, but also be made of nothing at the same time. I find it crazy. Like a piece of stone that has been there, or a big rock has been there for a million years. It seems static, however you look at it. But when you go closer and when you go to the atomic level, things are just oscillating with an unbelievable speed. So is it sitting there, or is it moving? And it's, again, this is made of space. This hard rock is made of basically empty spaces, mostly. And even when throughout the text, the word emptiness kept coming in, mingling with everything. So it's like a bit, and so you have that hollow in the disc, because you have the disc. Without the disc, you wouldn't have the hollow and the empty space. So they're so interrelated.
It's an incredible artifact, isn't it? The one we started with, the bi-disc.
Yes.
Because there's no tool that can cut jade. You have to do it through friction.
Oh, wow. Oh, I didn't know.
It's not carved, it's sum total of all the friction applied to it.
I run the risk of completely misinterpreting, as I did last week with Jonathan, with your comments on Michael Chris Martin's exhibition at the Royal Academy, which I thought your review sounded really interesting, but was maybe a kind of a critique of sorts. But I thought it was one of the last readings of the presentation this evening, and it talked about blandness. And I thought it was a really interesting kind of piece of writing. This idea that drive comes from a lack, but there's a kind of possibility of imagining a blandness within that from which desire or becoming can seep into or emerge from. And it almost sounded like a kind of a, I don't know, maybe I was, as I say, misinterpreting, but it almost sounded like a statement of what art could do at the end of art, or the beginning, as you said, in relation to other things. And I was thinking about your own work. This is why I sort of say I hope I'm not misinterpreting, but the kind of the huge numbers of paintings that you've done, Jonathan, that have a kind of emptiness to them, maybe even a blandness to them. But there's also a kind of creative potential that comes out of the way that you arrange them in different ways. So they kind of exist almost as a bland object, but then they kind of gain some kind of, or something emerges out of how they're arranged. When you showed your work in the presentation earlier in the year, when they're kind of arranged on the wall in certain kind of grids or geometric forms or in stacks, or when you kind of move them around and imagine relationships between them on the floor. And you don't have to comment, but I was kind of reflecting on that as an idea of art as a emergence out of an engagement with blandness.
It's interesting because I think actually I find this idea of emptiness and everything so attractive, and I actually use this concept in my work, and that's one of the reasons I use the black and white next to each other. I've got some of it here. We've got sculptures of like painted black and white, and for me that's sort of the opposite, being next to each other. Like it gives it intensity, and for me it gives it it projects out the meaning and the feelings. It's like male and female. So everything and nothingness and emptiness and everything is just, for me, it's like that. They both need each other.
Last points, we've got another half an hour to go.
I'm just hoping in the reading of Jonathan's artwork of arrangement of bland, engagement with blandness, they were not part of his art project, and there's a whole bunch of us as bland tiles sitting here. And he's a constant rearrangement of us in the space, whether we be on Zoom or in person in town.
Well, we're not the Coke Zero, so that's that's the opposite, you know.
Yesterday, I have asked Jonathan some questions about painting, and I asked marks and logical of sensation, and some ideas about my own practice. And Jonathan replied me some beautiful writing. There is a paragraph is related emptiness. I would like to share it. I can read it to you guys. It's very beautiful. Think of the play between landscape, bodyscape, and manscape, which is inherent in traditional landscape art on the level of abstraction. Traditional painting does not represent the world, but rather it presents the conditions of becoming a world passion through emptiness as a condition. For this reason, it is elusive, but in a way that connects all things with a state of contemplative rapture. It's really beautiful. And there have another 2 paragraphs I would like to share too, because it's really touchable. Painting is a thin tissue that exists between the seeable and the sayable, that favors the in-between of silence and the invisible. That is why we might return to the same painting again and again, because we lack the sense of ever seeing or knowing the extent of what we are witness to. Sometimes a painting might appear to be dumb, lacking in mobility, but then it might open out the sensible in a way that takes us by surprise. It can be described as a network of sensations giving rise to a constellation of effects. Painting might be a sum total of descriptions, equally the additions of inscriptions, but also a progress of inscription or the taking away of marks, brushes, crayons, sponges, rags, or spraying implements might all be employed in the process of setting things in place. This is both a physical process and a way of being with the exercises or the various faculties. The way that they serve to mix the physical and mental registers becomes the event of the painting. This event might be a least condition whereby it can be designated as an artwork or be in exceed in what is stages. The reality of a painting either frames or stages. The sense of exceeds or lack, the actual arrest of a painting is not within its bounded condition, but in its gesture towards its exteriority. Thank you. So very beautiful. Thank you, Jonathan.
I was drunk.
You're not asleep.
Where are you guys going again on Thursday? I'm jealous.
Going to 12:30, started at Frith Street Gallery, Rolling Dumas. Going to work our way across to Cork Street and see an exhibition of Leisure Clark, Brazilian artist, mainly in the 60s and 70s. And Ropek Gallery painting exhibition. And one or two others. We might go to Savile Row, see what's going up there. A walk around for 3 hours, 2.5, 3 hours.
Lovely. Oh, wonderful.
Everyone's invited.
No, I wish I could come.
We all can get lost. As we did last time.
I really miss you guys.
And I'm going to have an opening there on that day. If you still have energy to come after our trip, welcome to the ASC Gallery.
Are you gonna put it in chat?
Yeah.
Johnson, have you got WhatsApp now?
Yeah.
Good. Awesome. What are we doing next Monday? What's the topic for next Monday?
We've got to decide. Let's have a vote.
Meanwhile, I am trying to move. I'm trying to buy a house and sell my flat. So I don't live in a flat anymore. And the house is a dump. It's completely unmodernized. But it's lovely. It's got a really good feeling. And I was just thinking, if it all works out, maybe we can do an exhibition there. It's like a Victorian house. I don't know, is it allowed?
Whereabouts is it?
It's in North Kensington, next to a park, a little park. It's about 12 minutes walk from White City Station.
Wow, that's nice.
Yeah, I was just thinking, actually, that would be, why not? Because if it's my own house, I can decide, right? And you have to get permission from everyone. But
I don't know. I think if you're not charging a fee, then you're doing your own private function, really.
There's party.
Yeah, I couldn't see.
we can call it